We're good. You can sit and catch your breath and water. Good evening. I am so glad that everybody, including our speaker, were able to navigate a city that's come to a standstill with the president and vice president in town. It's good to have you all here. We have a full house. I was looking recently back through the catalog of books and maps and minerals, etc., belonging to the Athenaeum in 1817, and noting that there were a lot of histories, ancient histories, recent histories of England and the United States and France and Rome. Everybody had to have Gibbon's History of Rome at that point in time. We also had a 2-volume copy of Thomas Bridges' book called Homer Burlesqued. I want to find a copy. I don't know that we still have a copy. I need to ask Jill. It was published originally in 1762 under the pseudonym Caustic Barebones. And obviously it was a burlesque of Homer. What I think that suggests is that from the beginning, the Athenaeum has been a place where people have wanted to learn together about our past and our present and our future by studying serious history as well as fiction, through serious conversation as well as through laughter. That we are a community of people who are engaged in learning and discourse. And I hope that is something that you all enjoy. I'm guessing you do because you are here tonight. If you are not a member of the Athenaeum, I hope that you come away tonight saying, I want to learn more and I want to become a part of this community and help to further enlarge our conversations and our laughter and our learning. If you are a member, I hope you will continue to find ways to support the work that we do. I welcome you all tonight. If you do not know me, I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. I don't always carry those crutches, but they will come in handy after the talk as I serve as the bodyguard for our speaker to get her into the book signing. I will whack you all away with my crutches. No, really, I won't, but I'm so delighted to have you all tonight here for our talk. Now, I've been also, among other things, perusing the long slew of profiles that have been published on tonight's speaker, asking myself, can a classicist be a rock star? I don't know if you become a scholar and think, I am going to become an icon, particularly in my life, but you know, it's amazing. Tonight's speaker has had profiles in journals as diverse as Slate and Esquire. Their title of theirs was Emily Wilson Wants to Make You Cry. The Atlantic, the New York Times, and the New Yorker. And with all of this and with her work and her scholarship, Emily Wilson, I think, has achieved that rare status of being an iconic scholar. Judging also by the long queue on the waiting list for this evening's talk, we are truly lucky to have her here with us. So it's my pleasure to welcome tonight Emily Wilson, who is the College for Women Class of 1963 term professor in the Humanities and professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Wilson has received a slew of honors, including being a fellow of the American Academy in Rome in Renaissance and early modern scholarship, a MacArthur Fellow, and a Guggenheim Fellow. You may have read her 2017 best-selling translation of Homer's Odyssey, lauded as the first such translation by a woman, but I think she'll probably talk to you and tell us that, you know, that's not how she primarily wants her translation to be known. But she's also last year released her translation of the Iliad. And some of you may also have been participating in the book group started by our own Kara Sloan here at the Athenaeum this spring, reading through these works as a group and enjoying them and learning from them together. Tonight we will get to learn from Dr. Wilson about the art of retranslating classic works, and I invite all of you to join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Wilson to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. So I'm going to figure out if I know how to use this. Probably do, yes. So I'm going to, no, is this going to work? I just want to make sure I know how to use it.
Maybe it's on.
Is there some other way to do it if I don't, if it's beyond me? Doesn't work, right? Oh, I didn't do this. I didn't do what you told me to do. Sorry, that's my fault.
We'll pull this one back up.
Yes. It's fine.
Yeah, it's not working.
It doesn't work. It's okay. I can just use that, right?
Yeah.
Is that fine? Does that work? That doesn't work either. It might work. Can make it work. Doesn't work either. Oh, there he goes. There you go. Yes, it does. Yay, wonderful. Great job, Athenaeum. Great job, technology. So we say thank you to Hephaestus, who's the god of technology, who obviously helped in that moment. So today I promise that I will be done in time for everyone to have snacks, because I saw the snacks outside. They look very tempting. So I'm going to start with a very short reading from the beginning of the Iliad. I'll talk a little bit about what translation is in general and what my approach to translation is. Then I'll do a sort of deep dive case study into a single passage in multiple translations. Then I'll do a sort of why read Homer now? How might the Homeric poems resonate now? Then I'll do a final, slightly longer reading, and then if there's time for questions, that would be great. Otherwise, people can have snacks, and I will be done in less than an hour, I promise. So I'm going to start by doing just the first lines of the Iliad, first in the original and then in my translation. I know many people here don't necessarily read Homeric Greek, but I think even if you don't, I hope you can hear that the original poem is a poem and is metrical, rhythmical, musical, designed to be experienced out loud. And those qualities, to me, are essential to the whole experience, and ideally things which I wanted to convey in translation, as well as the semantic meanings. Many naidetha pelea do ekeleos ulomanen hemuria kaios algia theka polas dipthimus psukasa idi proiapsin heroon autuste heluria chuke kunessin oio noisita daita dios teteledo bule exudeta pruta diaste tenerisanta atredes tenaxandron kai dios Achilles. So that's the original, and then that's the high point of my talk. It's all going to go downhill from there on out. Homer is great, and you should all learn Homeric Greek if you have the chance to do so. The original is in dactylic hexameter, which is a meter that's not native to the Anglophone tradition, so I felt I couldn't use that same meter and make it fly in the same way that the original does, and that I therefore used the meter that is traditional in narrative and dramatic verse in English, which is iambic pentameter. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. Okay, so now I'm going to talk just a little bit about what translation in general is. And the first thing I want to emphasize is that translation is always really difficult, not just if it's from an ancient language and not just if it's a translation of a fancy-pants ancient poem. It's difficult even if it's a road sign or a shampoo bottle, if you don't have really good immersion in the idioms of the language into which you're translating, as well as the idioms and language usage and society of the language out of which you're translating, then you're going to mess up and it's going to be hilarious, or you're not going to achieve the effects that you want to achieve. So I think people tend to think, if they haven't thought very much about it, that translation is primarily about understanding the original. And I think people very often, when they first sort of ask me about, oh, it must be really hard to read Greek, which, sure, it is hard to learn ancient Greek really well, but that's only half of what my job is. In fact, I think it's less than half of what my job is when I'm working as a translator, as opposed to when I'm working as a critic or scholar in other forms of engagement with ancient literature. Translation, at least half of it, is a form of writing. It's writing English words that will create a very specific effect, ideally the effect that's the same in some sense of whatever equivalence is as the original. What does the same mean? That's a very difficult question, as I think it is in general, about what is likeness? What is the likeness in the case of a portrait, or any kind of likeness is a difficult concept. I think we tend also, if we haven't thought that much about translation, to approach it in terms of binaries that I tend to think are quite misleading. I think the most common one has to do with the idea that a translation is either poetic, meaning it's pretty but it's kind of a lie, it's nothing like the original, or it's the literal translation, meaning it's exactly the same as the original, a kind of sameness that's achieved just by making the syntax echo the original syntax and plonking down the dictionary definitions of the words. And that's not actually the same, if the same includes something like the same effects. If the original is a poem, I would think that if it's not poetic, then something that's essential in the original is you're telling something false about that if you don't convey poetic qualities. Similarly, the syntax of a text, even as we've seen, a road sign, is not the whole truth about it. What you want to convey by a piece of text is not fully captured by just looking up the words in a dictionary in the way that you might if you're trying to pass a language exam. I think some of we can talk also later, if anyone wants to, about these other binaries. The concept of domesticizing versus foreignizing is a big thread in translation studies, and some translation theorists argue that we should push towards greater foreignization where possible, where we should try to evoke the unfamiliar and alien qualities of a text which wasn't originally composed in English. I think it's actually impossible to produce a text that is completely foreignizing, that completely conveys what exactly is alien about this original. Even if you transcribe the original, you're still actually conveying a text that's different in a different cultural context. Similarly, I think there are ways that people sort of tend to simplify the idea of what is an archaizing translation, what is a modern translation. Archaizing and historicism itself is a modern invention. I'm not sure that there's a way to produce an ancient text that's going to be authentic in the way that people may imagine an archaizing English text might be authentic. Because, of course, English as a language did not exist at any period overlapping with ancient Greek. I think the ways of thinking about translation that oversimplify ideas of language tend to be actually worse in classics than in other disciplines where we think about non-Anglophone literature, partly because of the pedagogy which is present in the pedagogy of ancient languages. So in beginning Mandarin class or beginning French class, students tend not to have an idea that what they're learning to do is to quote-unquote translate. Students tend to think, when I start to learn Spanish, what I'd like to do is be able to have a conversation with somebody who speaks Spanish. I might like to be able to watch a telenovela and be able to understand the dialogue. I might be able to be fluent in this language. Whereas when students start in Latin class, they very often don't have any idea that it might be possible to be immersed in Latin and have a fluent reading of Cicero, where you're not writing your own hideous English on top of the beautiful Latin that you're being invited to engage with. So I think that idea of translation as this sort of instrument that is designed to help with language learning, but also can actually impede language learning, I think then contributes to people having an idea that a translation from an ancient language must be somehow in the same model as the kind of translations that my students produce for exams, where the point of them is to demonstrate to the teacher, I understood the syntax, I did my homework, and I looked up the words in the dictionary. And of course, that's not the goal of my translations. I mean, when I publish a translation, I'm not trying to prove to the public that I did my homework. I'm trying to convey an experience of the original, of what it might be like to be immersed in the original, understanding it. And so just to sort of sum up some of the things I've been trying to say, these are all self-portraits of Picasso by Picasso. People, I think, very often also have an idea that if something is different between one translation and another, maybe that's because one of them got it wrong and the other one got it right. That's not the kind of difference that's going on in these different portraits. It's not that Picasso was truthfully painting himself when he was in the blue period and then was untruthful about himself once he started mixing the eyes to both to the same side of the face. They're all truthful. They're all attempts to convey the reality of who he is or who he sees himself as. And so similarly, I think the differences between, sorry about that, I feel like I'm mismanaging the microphone here. Sorry. The differences aren't necessarily about mistakes. They can be about a different vision of what the priorities are in the original and what the possibilities are for recreating those crucial elements with using whatever language you're using. And of course, for me, that's the language, the English language of the 21st century. And that's a different language from the English language of even a decade ago. So my priorities as a translator. So as the introduction already suggested, thank you for that, the headlines, of course, always simplify, and these were no exception. I thought it was funny how very consistent they were in the narrative, in the media narrative. The headline for the Odyssey translation, there was a ton of coverage, for which I was very, very grateful, and almost all of it was, oh, wow, she's a woman, and it was amazing. And then for the Iliad, they couldn't use that headline because Caroline Alexander, kudos to her, had already published a translation of the Iliad into English. So the narrative of all women have exactly the same perception of Homer and would translate Homer in the special girls' way didn't actually fly anymore, so they had to come up with a different narrative, which was that my work is extraordinarily modern, which you can see from the fact that I use regular meter and phrases like cataclysmic wrath, which I don't think it entirely makes sense once you think about it for more than a second or two, but there you go. I think it also is actually quite interesting that I think modern is there used as code for interesting or clear, and as if ancient couldn't mean those things, as if nobody in antiquity had any feelings or was any good at writing poems. Which I don't think is actually true. So in terms of my background, the things that I think are important for my work, I think in general, translators always have to bridge two worlds. In the case of a translator from antiquity, of course, I'm bridging both two languages and also antiquity and modernity. So I think it may be important that there are several other sort of types of worlds and cultures that I've bridged in my life and in my career. One is, of course, that as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in the UK. I spent the first 25 years of my life there, and I got degrees there before coming to the US for grad school. Which I think is not just a sort of biographical factoid, but it actually makes a difference in terms of the particular ways that I was exposed to Homer, both in translation and not in translation. Because I didn't go to high school, or a particular kind of high school in the US, I never had a a teacher or a professor say, you must read this translation of Homer, it's wonderful and it's the canonical right one. Because in the Oxford system, they were totally snobby about translations, and I was never told to read any translation. So I imprinted on the original rather than on any particular 20th century free verse American translation. So it was actually surprising to me to realize how many people had imprinted on one of those particular translations, which I only got to know once I was teaching classics in translation in this country. And then the fact that I was in this country teaching classics, ancient literature in translation made me realize there's actually so many people who are engaging with the ancient world in really serious ways in classrooms as well as general readers who need good translations and who need to have those classroom conversations be enabled to be as rich and interesting as possible, which better translations can do that. At least different translations. I shouldn't be saying better, but in any case, different translations. Another bridge that I think is important in terms of my background is that I have degrees in English literature as well as in classics and complet. And so the fact that I really care about, degrees maybe don't matter, but the fact that I really care about the long history of Anglophone metrical poetry, I care about Shakespeare, I care about Milton, I care about the whole history of what has epic poetry or narrative and dramatic verse in English Anglophone meter meant before the 21st century, and I spent a lot of time reading those metrical poets. I don't think I could have done these metrical translations if I hadn't been immersed in the tradition of Anglophone verse as well as the tradition of Homeric verse. And I'm going to do two more bridges, and then I'll move on. One more is that I have, ever since I've sort of been writing, I've been interested in trying to engage with audiences outside the academy as well as audiences inside the academy. I mean, I've written a lot of reviews, essays, pieces for the sort of semi-popular public press, the kind of publications that you just cited, where they profiled me. It's partly because I've written for a lot of those publications already, I think. So I'm interested in engaging with both my colleagues, but also with people who aren't necessarily in a literal classroom, but who may well have a lot of interesting thoughts and questions about ancient literature and the ancient world. And then the final thing I want to say is that before I became a translator, which I never thought I was going to be, my career was very much about what happened to ancient literature after antiquity. So I was always interested in reception and in how ancient texts got transformed and rewritten and written back to in later periods. And so that interest in reception has been part of my practice as a translator, and it's exciting to me to get to be a translator, partly because it's a way of participating in the process of how might Homer be received and reread over the course of the next generation. So I know that most people know me only as a translator of Homer, so I wanted to flag the fact that I didn't start, that wasn't my first published translation. And ideally, the little creature at the bottom is not there because it's a book cover, but because it's a chameleon. And the point that I want to make is that I think translators need to be different when they're sitting on different leaves, or be different when they're translating a different text. My first published translations were of Seneca's tragedies. I love Seneca. I love both his prose and his... Oh my gosh, I did not mean to do that, sorry. Sorry. Maybe the clicker suddenly started working. I don't know. That's a miracle. So I love Seneca, and I want to emphasize that because I think people sometimes think, if they've only read, especially my Odyssey translation, that I'm somehow allergic to bombast, which could not be further from the truth. I love bombast. I love melodrama. I love show-off literary allusions, where it's sort of, you're packing in, how much have I read, and how much can I show off about all the different quotable quotes I can put in there. It's all great, and that's very Senecan, but I don't think it's at all Homeric. So I want the feel, the texture of the verse to be different, depending on what the original is that I'm translating. Similarly, I've published translations of Euripides and of Sophocles' Oedipus, Tyrannos, and I want those also to be different from one another as well as different from Seneca. I would feel that there would be something wrong with what I'm doing if I make the dense metaphors in Sophocles, which of course it matters for Sophocles' technique in general, especially in that play, that it's enigmatic and you always have to figure out how are there two different things being said at the same time. That's not how Homeric metaphor works. It's how Sophocles' metaphor works. Similarly, the sort of clever chattiness of Euripides is a very different style from any of the others that I have up on the screen there. And then similarly, the Odyssey is very different in mood from the Iliad, even though they're from the same period, they're in more or less the same language, though of course the objects are different, so the vocabulary is somewhat different because there are so many more weapons and that kind of thing. But the whole mood and atmosphere is very different, and I want the reader of my translations to be able to feel this is different. Okay. So in general, I think people tend to think that it's important, perhaps, for a work of scholarship to be not completely replicating everything that every other scholar writing on this subject has said before. And if it's a work of investigative journalism, people want to know, did you find out something new? But if it's a translation, people very often don't even ask the question, does it add anything new? Is it any different from any of the other gazillion retranslations of the same text that we've already had? In the case of a retranslation, I think one should ask that question as well. I think it can be very, very good, but if it's almost exactly the same as 10 other translations, then it was a little bit of a waste of time, especially given that translating an epic poem is likely to take 5 or 6 years of your life. And I don't think I would have done it at all if I didn't feel there were things I could do in retranslating Homer that might be both deeply authentically engaged with the original and also not the same as what was already out there for my students and for general readers who weren't going to read the Greek. In general, my priorities have to do with sound is a crucial one. I felt frustrated as a teacher of the Homeric poems and also of these verse dramas, but especially of Homer, with the fact that most of the most prominent, most used Anglophone modern translations of Homer didn't use regular meter. And so I thought if I'm not going to do anything else, at least I can use regular meter, and I can convey to my students that these poems are metrical. And even if you don't typically read metrical poetry, if you read it out loud, it's going to feel different. Similarly, the multiplicity of moods and voices, the flexibility of Homeric narrative in terms of the narrative is always shifting around from one point of view to another. That's been a big insight in Homeric studies over the last 10 or 20 years, which I think wasn't recognized nearly to the degree it is now among Homerists a generation ago. And I felt that many of the existing translations didn't do enough to accommodate the difference between this is how Achilles talks, this is how Agamemnon talks. They don't sound exactly the same. And so I think it also matters that as per the previous slide, but one, a lot of my other work and other interests has been in drama as well as in epic. So I'm interested in how do texts create multiple different voices within a single experience. I'm interested also as a translator in pacing as a crucial element of the experience of the original. I felt that also that maybe particularly with Homer, but it's true of other texts too, that translators who don't deliberately try ahead of time not to limit themselves in some way about the pacing of the original are going to end up with a translation that's far longer, because of course no single word in the original exactly corresponds to any word in English. So the temptation is always there, and I wrestle with this temptation myself every day to put down 10 different words, because it covers all the bases, and then you've translated everything. But what you haven't translated is the original was quick, and your translation is now soggy and 10 times as long as the original was. And so you're going to bore the reader in places where the original was not boring, because it's much slower. So with the Odyssey, I confined myself to the same number of lines to force myself not to do that. And then with the Iliad, I realized I couldn't do that because for reasons that I can get in, maybe are too technical to share, but primarily because there are so many more names in the Iliad. And a name is going to take as long as it takes. Agamemnon, son of Atreus, takes up my whole line, and there's no way to say it faster. Whereas Polymekanos, I can translate that as wily or crafty, and I've saved the syllables, and I can make it work. It's a tricky kind of technique, but I could do it, whereas I couldn't do it with a name. I felt actually with the Iliad it was nice that I let myself have just a little bit more flexibility in terms of line count, but I still wanted to think about pacing all the time. And then final thing I just want to flag is emotional effect. I mean, as in that headline that you just quoted, I want to make you cry. I think if the original makes me cry or gives me goosebumps, then it's an obligation to do my very best to create those effects in the reader of my English. And of course, there's no sort of preset recipe for how do you give the reader goosebumps. But Homer gives me goosebumps in the original very, very frequently. And so whatever I can do to try to inculcate a sense of both this is poetic, this is multi-voiced, and also this is thrilling and heartbreaking, and I'm having a lot of feelings. It's not just that the characters are represented as having many feelings, but the feelings are inspiring feelings in the audience or the reader. If possible, I think those things should be part of what I'm trying to do. And of course, I'm never going to succeed in all of the goals that I may have about any translation. Okay, now I'm going to do a little deep dive into just a single passage of the Iliad. So I haven't really talked about the Iliad at all so far, and I know some people are studying it in your lovely group, which sounds so fun, and some people may not have read it recently, so I'm just going to do a 1-second summary of the story so far. The Iliad, which if you only know the title, you may have a very misleading idea about what the poem is about. Ilion is Troy, so the title suggests this is a poem about Troy. If you know anything about the Trojan War myths, you may know it's about Paris abducting Helen from Sparta, Helen, wife of Menelaus, from Sparta, taking her to Troy, thus arousing the rage of all the suitors who vowed to band together with her chosen husband to get her back. There's the judgment of Paris, there's the muster of all the ships at Aulis, then fight, then there's the wooden horse, then there's the sack of Troy, and so on. None of that stuff gets in the Iliad. It doesn't have the beginning, doesn't have the end, doesn't have the Trojan horse. And I think it also equally surprising for a Greek poem about a war in the world to the east of Greece. It's not focused on us versus them. It's not focused on we Greeks went and bashed the Easterners. Instead, it's focused on conflicts between Greek and Greek, Achilles and Agamemnon, Hector and Paris, Hera and Zeus. It's conflicts within societies just as much as conflicts between those three societies of the gods, the Trojans, and the Greeks. The word that the poem starts with that I just told you, Mernis, at the start of this, Mernin aeda. Mernis suggests a particular superhuman kind of rage, which I translate as wrath because it's not normal human anger or rage, for which there are other words in the poem. Achilles' wrath is superhuman or divine because, for all kinds of reasons, it echoes the wrath of a god, such as the wrath of Apollo, who can cause plague in the Greek camp without having to go up and individually spear each member of the human population. I mean, as we know from COVID, gods don't kill like that. Gods kill without necessarily touching you or spearing you. Achilles manages to cause devastation and massacres on his own side without moving. He's not moving his swift feet. He's sitting in his tent doing his speech, and yet the Greeks are dropping dead. Because in his absence, thanks to the enabling of his sea goddess mother, and who has a sort of special hotline to Zeus, the Trojan prince, Hector, in Achilles' absence, moves closer and closer and closer to the Greek ships, threatening to set fire to them, thus ensuring that the Greeks won't have a nostos, a journey home. Patroclus, Achilles' dearest friend and comrade, begs and begs and begs for him not to give up on the sulk and go back and fight, or if not, to let him put on his armor, be his second self, go out and fight as him. And of course, even though Achilles says, turn right back as soon as you do that, he doesn't. He keeps on going. Achilles and Patroclus have everything in common, including great skill and great talent and great love of killing people. And Patroclus loves that just as much as Achilles does. So he keeps on fighting, and inevitably, but still totally heartbreakingly, he dies. So this is, I'm going to do the passage, which I think is a really important emotional climax in the poem, where Achilles, featured here like a burrito, is mourning the death of his dearest person, Patroclus. And he's just learned the terrible news. His sea goddess mother, Thetis, comes and tells him this sort of classic parent thing, I did everything you asked for and you're still unhappy, and he is still unhappy. Achilles responds to her saying that she already did what he asked by saying it's completely useless. He didn't actually want that prayer fulfilled at all because now his dearest person is dead. His prayer was, of course, for the Greeks to die in his absence, not reckoning the Greeks is going to include Patroclus. Ten de barus denakon prosefer porosoukus Achilles. Mertere terminar moi olympios exedelesse. Elatim moi tonde dos. Epi philosole thetaeros Patroclos. Ton ego peripanton tion hetaeron. Isone me kefale. Ton apolesa. So this passage, I think, I already emphasized it's an emotional climax. Ideally, the emotional climax should be feelable in the translation. There are some really concrete dilemmas, as you could find in any, if you sort of stick your finger in any passage, there are always going to be impossible dilemmas. Apolesa, the verb means both I lost him and I destroyed him. That's a crucial choice, because is Achilles just grieving, or does he also feel, maybe it was my fault, because I sat here and did nothing while he went out and got himself killed? An idiom question. He says, I loved him, isone me kephale. In English, we don't say, I love my dearest person just like my head. And yet in Homeric Greek, clearly you do. So do you just translate by an equivalent idiom and say, I loved him very much, I loved him like a second self? Or do you say, or do you think maybe in a poem which has already had quite a lot of decapitations, literally, Agamemnon has gone around on the battlefield cutting off a lot of people's heads, maybe the metaphor is actually important, and maybe it matters that Achilles is going back to battle as if he's one of those headless people. It's as if he's already walking dead. And then there were sonic effects. I haven't got on the slide, but I also want to emphasize there were questions just about how do you translate the intimacy or lack of intimacy of the relationship? Achilles uses the verb tion of what he felt for Patroclus, which is sometimes rendered in dictionaries as respect or honor. But in English, if you say, I respected him very much, that doesn't suggest a relationship in which you spend 24/7 with somebody over the course of 10 years and you're broken when they die. It can suggest a somewhat distant relationship. So how distant or how intimate is this relationship? I'm not going to, just in the interest of us making sure we get our reception and all that, I'm not going to go slowly through each one of these, but I just want to flag a couple of things about some of them. So the first published translations of the Homeric poems entirely into English were by the great verse dramatist George Chapman. And I think they're wonderful translations. He did the Iliad into rhyming fourteeners, and he has these sort of interesting ways of interpreting the poem in the light of his own sort of cultural norms of both revenge tragedy, of which he was a master poet, and also the norms of Elizabethan Jacobean court culture and its intrigues. So the question of is Achilles a courtier who's got out of hand in relation to the monarch? One thing I would flag just about his rendering of this passage is the way that I think he somewhat Christianizes the language. So Olympius hath done me all that grace. The idea of divine grace, I think, is very alien to the way Zeus operates in Homer. He's not all that full of grace. Moving forward ahead in time, this is the wonderful translation by the great poet Alexander Pope from the 18th century. And you can see that it's in pentameter rhyming couplets, and it is, as is totally typical of Pope, both great and has a lot of wonderful touches that are completely made up by Pope. So, for instance, revenge itself is lost, which is completely his invention. Cureless grief, which again I think is a great invention. Instead of the head, we have beyond mankind, beyond myself is slain. And notice that these, along with all of them that I'm going to show you, I think, up till mine, present it as pure grief, not guilt. So that question of, does apolasa mean I destroyed him as well as I killed him? So we're zooming, in the interest of time, I'm skipping the 19th century entirely, but there are interesting translations from the 19th century as well. This is the prose translation from the Loeb Classical Library, which I think is interesting just to flag the fact that those translations in the Loeb are presented with the Greek facing on the opposite side, which of course is a gesture of authenticity. So even if you can't read one side of the page, you're sort of being promised this is exactly the same because you could check my work anytime you liked. And so I think it's interesting to notice the ways that the Loeb isn't actually exactly the same as the original. I mean, even beyond the obvious that this is in really weird English prose as opposed to Homeric Greek. And one thing that I think is interesting here is that even when even when it's not echoing the word order of the original, the Loeb, in this case, goes for archaism. So, for instance, the original has podasocus Achilleus, swift-footed Achilles. The epithet goes before the noun. In English, we tend to put adjective, then noun, whereas the Loeb puts the epithet after, Achilles, swift of foot, which it doesn't correspond to the Greek. It corresponds to the gesture of archaizing. And so it makes it sound more oldie-timey, even though it doesn't actually make it like the Greek in terms of word order. And then also, I guess I would note the way that it chooses to present the relationship as very much a work relationship, whom I honored above all my comrades. This is the Richmond Lattimore translation in the long unmetrical lines, and I guess I would note just the ways that it does some of the same things as the Loeb in terms of archaizing. So we have Achilles of the swift feet, and then we have similar gestures towards questions about how much does Achilles have a relationship either with Patroclus or even with his mother, but given that he addresses her as my mother, which an English speaker who actually has met their mother before might not naturally say in 1951 even. This is the Robert Fitzgerald one, which I think goes much further towards conveying some emotional punch into the moment. We can come back to any of them that you want, but I'm not going to pause too much on most of them, just because I know that one can spend hours on any passage. On the Fagles one, I just want to pause for a second because I know that it is a best-selling and much-read translation. So the thing I want to note about it in general, and this is definitely true of this passage, is that Fagles very often, in the interests of reader-friendliness, and I think in a way Fagles is much more of a modernizing translation than mine are, goes for adding in English-American colloquialisms, even when it means a metaphor that's different from the metaphors of the Greek. So, for instance, we have here burning desires. Burning desires are an English idiom, or English cliché, you could say. They're not a metaphor that's present in the Greek, but they're added in by Fagles to make it more reader-friendly. Which, again, I'm not saying that any of these moves either to make it archaic. Homer is old, so maybe that's a viable thing to do. Burning desires makes it sound idiomatic in American English, so maybe that's a viable thing to do, because the original is idiomatic in Homeric Greek. This is the Caroline Alexander translation, which I think is interesting partly because it was published in the 21st century, but I think in some ways looks back to the tradition of translation of the Richmond Lattimore. It has many of the same ideas about how to approach translating the Homeric poems, including the archaisms like mother mine. And this is my translation of that same passage. Swift-footed Lord Achilles, groaning, answered, "Yes, mother, Zeus has granted me that prayer. But now what good to me is any of it? My friend Patroclus, whom I loved, is dead. I loved him more than any other comrade. I loved him like my head, my life, myself. I lost him, killed him." And I guess the main comment that I want to make about this is that you can see how I totally fail to live up to my principles, or that my principles are very often in complete contradiction with one another. So I said earlier that I very much care about pacing, and I also very much care about metaphor, and I also very much care about emotional effect. In the case of I loved him, I loved him like my head, I didn't feel either one was adequate. I felt I can't leave out the head, but I also can't just leave the head in there, because it's not going to land emotionally. So I have to expand, because unless I have both head, life, self, the reader isn't going to get what does it mean to lose your head if you've lost your dearest person. And similarly with I lost him, killed him, I'm translating the same verb twice, because the double meaning seems to me crucial to what's happening, even though that means there's one verb in the original, and I'm using two verbs in the translation. To me, the takeaway from all of this is not one of these translations is sort of the one that's better than all the others. They have different priorities. They bring out different things. The priorities that I have, even I can't live up to all of them all the time because they may be in contradiction one with the other. I do my best, but I also know that it's trying very hard at anything that's impossible is going to be, you're going to fail, and that's all you can do is fail better. Yes, okay, so what am I going to say? I guess the other thing that I want to say, which partly leads into the final section of the talk, but also is a sort of summary from this little exercise, is that I think even if you don't read the original, there's something fascinating about looking really closely at a tiny bit of text in multiple different translations, whether it's Homer or anything else. No translation, however careful or responsible it may be, is exactly the same as the original. None of them, even if some of them copy from each other, but none of them are identical. So I think it's also a fascinating exercise in close reading and in understanding the ways that a particular text is implicated with its own culture and its own scholarly norms, literary norms, poetic norms, but also cultural norms. I mean, as in Chapman's importing of grace or Pope's ideas about manners and human relationships, or the particular norms that might be there in the 20th and 21st century translations. Okay, so final, very short bit of the talk is that I think we do need retranslations of ancient texts, even if it's not about coming up with the definitive translation. Scholarship on these texts reveals new insights on them. I already talked a little bit about how Homerists now pay attention to narrative point of view in ways that they didn't a generation ago. Cultures change. We ask new questions about old texts. Languages also change. The English language of the 21st century is not the same as the English language of even the 1990s, let alone of the 1950s. And as I just tried to show with that previous exercise, there's no one translation that says everything that you could possibly say about a particular text, even with a single line or a single word. Themes, I mean, people very often ask me to trace why we read Homer now, themes of the Iliad with particular contemporary resonance. I'm not going to go through the slide about that because I just want to say there are many themes that have particular resonance, and I think the list that one comes up with now, or that I would come up with now at this moment in time, is different from the list I would have come up with if you'd asked me to do it 15 years ago. It's different from, I put plague and its repercussions as an essential, a medical crisis which leads to a leadership crisis. That's what the Iliad's about, and I noticed that in a way that I didn't pre-COVID. So that it's easy to come up with these kinds of lists, and I think that one of the big takeaways for me of that exercise is realizing that it's not just about some idea of the timelessness of these texts. It's also about the timeliness. It's about particular ways that this poem might resonate now that might be different from how it did resonate before, or how it may resonate in 20 years' time or 100 years' time if there were still humans in that much time. But I also would want to emphasize that I think the main reason to read these texts is because they're not relevant, because we tend so much to be embedded in the present moment. And it's so hard to sort of think beyond the present moment when so much is happening now. And there's all these wars and there's all this conflict in our society. And then we're always following the news. I think there's something really, really valuable about being immersed both in a very, very long, complex, serious, as well as sometimes funny, ancient poem, and also realizing humans were humans 3,000 years ago. Our society, our culture will be very different in future generations. We're in a time of enormous change. The Homeric poems were composed at a time of great change for archaic Greek speakers, and I think they speak to what happens to societies in periods of great change. And they also speak to us in the way of telling us there were humans, there were feelings, even when it wasn't modernity. So I'm going to end by reading a passage from the end of the Iliad, not quite the end, the very end, but almost the end, when the encounter between the Trojan king Priam and Achilles. And this is sort of the moment when Achilles is setting aside his menace, his overwhelming divine rage, to be able to have a momentary, peaceful, i.e. not killing each other, meal and conversation with his military enemy, the father of the man he's killed, Hector, who killed Patroclus. It's a sort of cliche convention to say that the Iliad is about war, grief, and rage, whereas the Odyssey is about homecoming and hospitality. But the poems, of course, go together. The opposite is also true of the Odyssey. It's also about war. It's also about grief. It's also about rage. And the Iliad ends with scenes, books 23 and book 24 of the Iliad are all about hospitality and homecoming. They're all about how can Achilles get home. He's never going to get back literally to Phthia, but he can get back to the quasi-home of being with other human beings. And how can Hector get home? Hector, we've seen him constantly leaving home, leaving the city. He gets his nostos, his time back home, thanks to the intervention of his brave father, although, as you can see, he's lying on the ground because he's dead. So Achilles has been consumed by this monumental rage and allows for this temporary humanitarian pause in the fighting. We know, I think it also is very moving that it is only a humanitarian pause for 12 days. We know that the fighting will break out again soon. Huge numbers more people will die very soon, including Achilles himself. But for this moment, they're able to meet each other and recognize each other. So I'm just going to read the beginning of that scene and then wrap up. So Achilles just had dinner, but he's going to have more snacks with Priam, so it's still suitable as a way to get on to the reception. He had just finished with his food and wine. The table was still at his side. Great Priam came in unnoticed. He stood near Achilles and touched his knees and kissed his hands, the terrible, murderous hands that killed so many sons. As when delusion seizes hold of someone who kills a man in his own fatherland and comes to a community of strangers and goes inside the house of a rich man, and everyone who sees him there is shocked. So was Achilles shocked when he saw Priam appearing like a god. So were they all. Startled, they glanced at one another. Priam spoke to Achilles, and this was his prayer. Godlike Achilles, think of your own father, who is as old as I am, standing over the final threshold between age and death. The people and the neighboring estates probably threaten him, and there is no one to save him from the danger of destruction. And yet at least he hears you are alive, and so his heart is glad, and every day he hopes to see his own beloved son come home from Troy, while I have been the most unlucky man alive. In spacious Troy I had the finest sons, of whom not one is left. I once had 50 in the days before the Greeks arrived. And from one womb 19 were born to me. My household women bore me the others. Most of them were killed by furious Ares who undid their limbs. I had just one who kept our town and people safe, and you killed him a short while ago while he was fighting for his fatherland Hector, I came here to your ships for him, to ransom him from you. I brought with me a countless ransom. Please, Achilles, show reverence towards the gods and pity me, remembering your father, Peleus. I am more pitiable than him. I have endured what no man yet on earth has done. I pressed my mouth into the hand of him who killed my son. This made Achilles yearn to mourn his father. With his hand, he gently took hold of the old man and pushed him back. Then both remembered those whom they had lost. Curled in a ball beside Achilles' feet, Priam sobbed desperately for murderous Hector. Achilles wept, at times for his own father, and sometimes for Patroclus. So their wailing suffused the house. Stop there. Thank you. Do a couple of questions,
and paraphrase them.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
This question I'm going to ask on behalf of the and I started with different translations, but something a little bit more readable.
Mm-hmm.
So I went out and saw yours, and I was explaining that I had asked, why did Professor
Yes. Good. So the question was, why did I do the Odyssey first? The answer is because I was asked. The publishers very much wanted the Odyssey because it's so much more often read. But in ninth grade, high schools. The Odyssey requires fewer content warnings in terms of eyeball spearing than the Iliad does. So I think that's part of the reason, and just the narrative of a homecoming journey, I think, is imagined to be more teachable than the narrative of rage and grief and more death, which, of course, is also... I think it's actually a mistake to think teenagers are not interested in those things, because I think they very much are interested in those things. But in any case, just the particular curriculum conventions meant that Norton was sure that they could do something. Also, I was involved, I didn't mention this before, but I was involved in I'm still an editor on the Norton Anthology of World Literature, which includes the Odyssey entire, but it only includes bits of the Iliad, which kind of drives me crazy. I think it would be nice to switch it up, but that's not going to happen because the instructors don't want to change that. So that also meant that Norton had a reason to want the Odyssey first. Yes. Yeah, so there have been so many perks to publishing these translations, one of which has been getting to know Madeline Miller, who's native of Narberth, or lives in Narberth, and she's lovely. I think those are great. I find Song of Achilles very moving. Obviously these are retellings that are doing, in a way, they're within the tradition of what Euripides does with Homer, what Aeschylus does with Homer. They're taking the same myths and converting them into a different set of generic conventions, a different cultural, societal context. The genre of the novel, the genre of either the love story novel, the tragic love story of Song of Achilles, is very, very different from the narrative of the Iliad itself. Of course, the Achilles-Patroclus relationship is still intense and important, but it's not. The narrative of how it happens is very different from Song of Achilles. But that doesn't mean that Madeline isn't allowed to do what she likes. Of course she's allowed to do what she likes. I've also, I enjoyed Silence of the Girls, the Pat Barker one, based on the Iliad. There were a lot. I think some of them are better than others, because publishers, of course, have seen a marketing opportunity, and now there's 10 million of them. And some of them are good. I like Song of Achilles, yeah. Yes.
So, your reading was brilliant.
Well, thank Thank you. You should do what works for you. The audiobook of the Iliad is read by Audra MacDonald, in case that helps you to make up your mind. She did an amazing job. It won an Audible Award, thanks to her wonderful performance. She has a great voice. She does the voices in a way that individuates them. I think she really knocked it out of the park. So I would recommend that audiobook if you ever listen to audiobooks. But, I mean, some people do a mix. I mean, some people listen while you're walking your dog and then flip through when you're at home. Yeah. But it's certainly it's a natural for Homer, because of course in antiquity people didn't have headphones, but they listened to Homer primarily out loud rather than in a scroll. Yes. Yeah, Claire Danes did the audiobook for the Odyssey. Yes, and they're very different styles. So I think it might also be listen to a sample of both and see what you like. Yes. Yes. Is it challenging to translate humor from ancient Greek into something a modern audience can understand? I've never done a Aristophanes translation. I'd kind of like to one day. I think that's a different kind of humor. I mean, the humor that's based on sort of contemporary political references and people who are alive right now, let me make fun of that person in the audience, that person in the audience. That's a very different kind of thing from anything you get in Homer, or even Euripides, who's often also very funny. I mean, one of my priorities was to try to convey the tonal variety, including the moments of humor in Homer. And, I mean, I think Homer is often very funny, but then I want it not to be sort of too funny or make it seem like I'm making fun of the text. I mean, one of the things I really wrestled with the Iliad in the first book was how to make sure the quarrel scene, where it's Achilles and Agamemnon hurling insults at each other, I felt in my first drafts it was kind of too funny and too much like, this is hilarious, rather than there are really high stakes here and they're both extremely upset for reasons you can understand. And maybe there's moments when it's like, ooh, this is kind of a funny line or funny image, but it shouldn't be laugh, or laugh at the characters all the way through. One should have empathy for the characters. And so getting that balance right, where it's, I both have empathy for the characters and also this is kind of funny, that those things should be true at the same time. I mean, some of the scenes in the Iliad, I mean, the Iliad is not usually marketed as a very funny poem, but it has some really funny bits. I mean, the seduction of Zeus by Hera is very funny, and I think it's hard to mess up the fact that it's funny, but I also felt that just making sure I'm doing what I can to, so for instance, Zeus's seduction, Zeus has this completely, he's the god of strategy, whose strategy in terms of getting his own wife into bed is terrible. His chat-up lines are all this same absolutely terrible chat-up line of, this is even better than when I hooked up with this mortal woman, and when I raped this mortal woman, and when I raped this other woman, and so on. So just making sure the rhetoric sort of feels both ornately rhetorical, so you can see his self-seriousness. I think that the humor very often comes from the character doesn't see how ridiculous he's being, or sometimes she, but in most cases in Homer, it's a he who's being more ridiculous than he knows. And I think that's a very gettable kind of humor. You know, as long as you're sort of being careful to sort of think through how much does the text look at this character either from the inside or the outside or both, I think you can get it. I mean, it takes some writing work. I mean, as with any translation, it's writing work to make sure it lands. Yes? That's an interesting question. So the question is, why is it relatively recent that Homerists have really paid attention to differences of voice and narrative point of view in Homer? I mean, I think part of it has to do with a sort of set of conventions that maybe have been with us since the 18th century about an idea about what is folk poetry and how primitive is Homer compared to the ornate classicism of Virgil, which had sort of been part of the European tradition continuously in a way that the Homeric poems had not. And so this sort of perception, once Homer did become widely known, of Homer the Homeric poems as stuff to be burlesqued. It's easy to burlesque Homer because, look, even the Homeric poems themselves have Ajax slipping in the dung, and look at these ridiculous characters being ridiculous, and civilized people don't behave like that. And so, it's not I mean, you might think, logically it's a bit of a leap to think that means that the poetic narrative storytelling can't be sophisticated, but I think that leap was maybe part of this sort of idea of it's primitive, it's very old, and therefore it can't be sophisticated in terms of how does it convey human relationships and storytelling and point of view. And I also think, so the work of Richard Martin, The Language of Heroes, it sort of drew on linguistics and thinking about language from other fields. I mean, I think a lot of the developments in classical studies over the last 100 years have been through sort of cross-generation between classics and other fields. I mean, anthropology and of course, also the researches of Parry and Lord in former Yugoslavia, sort of learning about how does actual oral poetry generation work, how does memory work, how does storytelling work within cultures where that was still alive at a period when people could go with a tape recorder and figure out how does it work, and then using that to sort of gradually unpick some of the preconceptions that people might have had before that about what might the primitive mind have been able to come up with. And of course, once you start to unpick that by actually looking at the evidence, it very often turns out that there's maybe no such thing as the primitive mind. Yeah. There were last two, yes. So over here first and then here.
During your translation, like the passages that open up to you
So were there passages that opened up to me or surprisingly new understandings? I mean, I felt that every day that I was working on it, I understood whatever passage I was working on a little bit better. And it's very hard to sort of spell out, what did I not understand now that I did? Because sometimes it's not a sort of very concrete thing. I mean, even just the passage I just shared with you, I don't think I'd spent long enough sort of pondering, does he mean destroyed, does he mean lost in that passage? And I think it's crucial, but I also hadn't spent long enough thinking about what exactly is the metaphor of the head doing in that line. Just the fact that translation involves this sort of very, very, very slow, close reading, it means that I was sort of endlessly rereading the same phrase over and over and over, and then doing that work of thinking about it, every day I would sort of feel like I'm coming a little bit closer to understanding this, but it's not like it's definitive. I mean, if I'd had another 10 years to work on these poems, I certainly would have done. Yeah, thank you. Yes? Yes, so the question is about the Greek text from which I translate. So modern editions of the Homeric poems, like modern editions of most ancient texts, are based on the texts that were collated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE, in the time of the Library of Alexandria, which is sort of when the dawn of modern scholarship was happening, where there was these scholar librarians who were putting together the various different scrolls of copies of Homer and figuring out what do we think was going on in that line, and do we agree with that reading or that reading. From those, and those then led in, the copy, led into the medieval manuscripts, which led into our modern texts. There aren't radical variations in the Homeric poems because they were very continuously read and studied. So in a way, the Homeric poems have a much more sort of consistent textual history than, say, the poems of Catullus, which are based on a much smaller manuscript history. There are manuscript variations. So one example, said the first few lines of the poem of the Iliad to you, which includes we have evidence of an ancient textual variant. Is it oio noisi ta pasi or oio noisi ta daita? So is it the dead bodies will be a feast for the birds or for all the birds? And we know from the ancient commentaries that there were ancient texts that had one of those and ancient texts that had the other of those. Most manuscripts have all the birds. I chose to go with banquet for the birds because I think it's more interesting as a reading and therefore more likely to have been corrected. And also I like the way that it generates alliteration, which is kind of fun. And I think also the way that it actually creates a better pairing for the dogs are wanting something that human warriors want. They want to get trophies from the battlefield. The birds want what human warriors want. They want a banquet. So that's that kind of thing happens in other places in the text where we have evidence of this or that word is different in different ancient readings, or this or that ancient commentator said that line shouldn't be in there. So we have these traditions about what did the ancient commentators and ancient editors say. We don't have evidence of a totally different Iliad which included the wooden horse, or which included the death of Achilles, which obviously were part of the ancient tradition, but as far as we can tell, they were never part of the Iliad. And so there's debate about at what period exactly did the poems we have, the written poems, sort of get fixed in more or less, give or take a banquet or a trophy, give or take those kinds of variants. When did they get fixed in more or less the form we have them? And I think it's probable that it was something like the 7th century and that something like the text of the poems we have was then used by rhapsodes to learn by heart and then perform over the course of those centuries before those texts got to the scholars of Alexandria. But there's scholarly debate about all of that. Some people think there was more variation in those centuries than I think there was. So, thank you for the question. Yeah. So should we stop there? Is that right? Yes. Okay. Yes. Thank you all. Yes.
As promised, we had a wonderful, wonderful conversation with Dr. Emily Wilson. I invite you, first of all, I'm going to take her over to the booksellers. Some of you brought copies of your books for her to sign. Head House Books is also selling copies. I invite you to buy one. The question about audiobook versus reading the book. Why don't you buy a copy for yourself and someone else, a friend, someone you live with? You can create your own audiobook, reading it together. Go to Emily's website. She has a pronunciation guide for all of the names. So if you get stuck, you can go there and figure out how to say it right and have a reading together orally as a group. So buy the books. We have a wonderful reception. Look forward to more conversation at the reception as you're talking with friends and new friends. And we thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you, Emily Wilson. It's been wonderful.